When we think of Rome, we think of a nation conquering, expanding its territory, a nation with genius tactics and highly trained units, a nation with a flourishing rich culture, building man's greatest architectural wonders, a nation with a man with great beards that laugh in the face of death. But we must also remember one thing about this great nation: their recreation. In this documentary we will discuss 4 different subjects: the bathing houses, the horse races, the gladiator fights, and a good old theater. In ancient Rome, thermae and balnea were facilities for bathing. Thermae usually refers to the large imperial bath complexes, like the baths of Caracalla, while balneae were smaller scale facilities, public or private, that existed in great numbers throughout Rome. Most Roman cities had at least one of such buildings, which were centers not only for bathing, but socializing. Roman bathhouses were also provided for private villas, townhouses, and forts. They were supplied with water from rivers or streams, or more normally by an aqueduct. The water would be heated using a complex heating system, which we will discuss later. First, we will discuss the general plan of the public baths, the balneae. Here you can see the plan of the old baths at Pompeii. We will begin with the atrium. The principal entrance, A, is removed from the street by a narrow footway surrounding the building. After descending the 3 steps, the bather finds a small chamber on his left, X, which contained the water closet, the latrina. Then he will proceed into the covered portico, G, which ran around an open court, the atrium. All of this together, A, G, and X, formed the vestibule of the baths, in which the servants waited. The atrium A was the exercise ground for young men, and perhaps this also served as promenade for visitors of the baths. Within this court, the keeper of the baths, the balnator, was also stationed. He exacted the payments from the visitors. In this court there were also advertisements posted up for the theater, announcements of general interest, and for gladiatorial shows. A passage E leads into the apodyterium, B. The apodyterium was a room for undressing. The removal of the bather's clothing was mostly taken in charge by slaves. The apodyterium was a spacious chamber with stone seats. The room had 6 doors. One of these was leading to the tepidarium, D, and another one leading to the frigidarium, C. Here you see an image of the apodyterium. The tepidarium was most of the times merely heated with warm air of a pleasant temperature. It was made like this to prepare the body to heat or to sudden cold. The tepidarium is generally the most highly ornamented room in baths. It was just a room to sit around and be anointed in. Here you can see an impression of the tepidarium. From the tepidarium a door opened in the caldarium, E. The caldarium was the hottest place of the bathing house. It was directly above the furnace of the hypocaust. It held a hot bathing tub and sometimes also just a dry place to sit and sweat. At one end there was a labrum with cold water that one could pour over his head before leaving the room. It works just like the saunas nowadays, Because of the heat, it was only slightly ornamented. Here you can see an image of the caldarium, with a labrum in the middle. In the next animation we will explain the working of the hypocaust. Here you can see the foundation of the caldarium. It was built up by a complex system of tubes for hot air and warm water. It often remains in the ruins of the baths. You can see such ruins in the next pictures. Underneath the floor, slaves would have to control a fire. The hot air would then flow through the hollow walls, or tubes, to the chimney. At the same time, the fire would be heating water held in a boiler. The heating would then create a flow of hot water. This whole system is called the hypocaust, or holocaust. In this complex, there is a different part for the woman. In some other baths, they just assign different opening times for the women, or men, and sometimes even for the sick. The entrance door B, which conducts into a small vestibule, M, and from there into the apodyterium, H. The next door leads to the tepidarium, G, which also communicates with the caldarium, F. It resembles the plan of the man's bath, but everything was smaller. The only outstanding difference is the great difference in the size of the vestibule. The next animation will give you an impression of the size of the thermi. The purpose of the baths was to get clean, socialize, and work out. People would clean themselves by anointing themselves in oil, and after having sweat, they would scrape it off with a striggle. In this picture you see people swimming in the tepidarium, and one man scraping oil off his body with a striggle. Amphitheaters. Everybody knows them. The wide, massive structures built in the good old times, just for the entertainment of mankind. This part of our documentary, we will explain why, when, and how they were made. Colosseum, one of the most massive amphitheaters ever created, was built by Vespasianus. This construction, set up in circa 70 before Christ, took about 10 years to build and is still standing at the moment we speak. But why was it built? Why did those good old Romans spend so many years to build such a huge structure? The answer to those questions is fairly simple. Entertainment. The old Romans knew different types of entertainment, like executions, performances, baths, and horse races. In ancient times, enormous constructions were built for all those kind of entertainment, and the Colosseum is one of them. In the Colosseum, about 55,000 people could watch and enjoy the games. Great hunts, better known as Venetians, and gladiator combats, where people were killed for the thrills of mankind. Also, public executions were held in this theater. Those games were organized according to a standard program. At first, Venetians were organized. In the afternoon, the clowns performed, and convicted criminals were executed. Afterwards, there were gladiator combats held in the Colosseum. Now you might ask yourself, what are Venetians? Venetians were events where professional hunters fought wild animals, or wild animals were fighting each other, until death followed upon. Those animals were brought to Rome from all over the world. This happened so much and so often, you could barely imagine how many animals were killed in the old Roman times. Now, the old Roman citizens commonly found this a terrific form of entertainment, and it was often combined with the execution of earlier mentioned criminals. If one of those criminals was convicted, ad bestias, they were forced to fight with animals until they were, for example, ripped apart by lions, or trodden down by elephants. The Romans usually made a show of these executions with a mythological setting, like the hunter Actaeon, who was ripped apart by his own dogs. By letting those criminals come to a horrible end, the emperor hoped to keep their citizens under control and show them they got to keep themselves to the law. The clowns in those times share a few noticeable things with our modern clowns. They did not have red noses, but though in that time acting was more focused on sex and aggression. After the Phoenicians, it was time for gladiatorial combat. All of you know the film Gladiator, you do? Great! Then you also should know that most of the time those gladiators were slaves and prisoners of war, just like Maximus. Sometimes also convicted criminals or even free citizens took part in the games. Free citizens could get lots and lots of fame and status this way. Even high-placed Romans sometimes chose to walk this path, though it was very risky and dangerous. Apart from that, gladiators were very popular in common. They were loved by both men and women. Some renowned women even paid to be allowed to spend the night in the arms of a strong gladiator.
Gladiators' virtues extend beyond the arena. As lovers, they're said to be ravenous beasts. Make him do it again.
After having had an education at Ludus, a gladiator school, they became professional gladiators in contract. For as those gladiators had a contract they had to keep themselves to, they couldn't decide to leave as easily as they had come in. This was the tricky part of gladiator combats. You had to entertain the crowd by fighting until you died, or until you received a wooden sword. In principle, the fights should continue until death follows upon, but often enough, gladiators were offered mercy by the crowd and the emperor. If a gladiator had fought good and long enough, they were offered a wooden sword and released from their contract. For slaves, this meant they were free to go. For free men, this meant a reward for their bravery and an allowance to leave the arena. The gladiator combats were generally held in duos. Especially popular was the combat between a heavily armed secutor and a rhetarius, wearing only a net and a trident, dagger, and shoulder protectors. The theater of ancient Rome was a thriving and diverse art form, ranging from festival performances of street theater, nude dancing, acrobatics, to the staging of comedies, and the verbally elaborate tragedies of Seneca. Although Rome had a native tradition of performance, the Greek Hellenization in the 3rd century before Christ had a great effect on the Roman theater, and encouraged the development of Latin literature. The first important works of Roman literature were the tragedies and comedies that Livius Andronicus wrote, 240 before Christ. 5 years later, Gnaeus Naevius also began to write drama. Roman plays used stock characters very often. Here are some examples. The adolescent was the hero, who is young, rich, and very brave. The parasitus lives only for himself. He is often seen begging for meals or being refused them. He lies for his own gain. The meretrix, prostitute, exists in 2 types. The first type, more experienced and has seen a lot. The second type is truly in love. Both are very attractive. Much of the architectural influence on the Romans came from the Greeks, so the Roman theaters resemble the Greek theaters quite well. However, Roman theaters have specific differences, such as being built upon their own foundations instead of earthen works, or on a hillside and being completely enclosed on all sides. You can lead the design of the Roman theaters back to the first permanent theater, the Theater of Pompey. Roman theaters were built in all areas of the empire, from Spain to the Middle East. In general, all of Roman theaters were the same. The theaters were all semicircular and had only minor differences depending on the region in which they were constructed. Because of the Romans' influence on local architecture, we see numerous theaters around the world with Roman attributes. There are some similarities between the theaters and around amphitheaters of ancient Rome. They were both constructed out of the same material, Roman concrete, and proved the place for the public to go and see numerous events throughout the empire. However, there are 2 entirely different structures, with a totally different layouts for different kinds of events. Amphitheaters did not need superior acoustics. Unlike those theaters in which it was a must. While amphitheaters would feature races and gladiatorial events, theaters hosted events such as plays, choral events, and orations. Their design with its semicircular form enhances the natural acoustics. The Roman theater also had a podium, which sometimes supported the columns of the scaenae fronts. The scaenae was originally not part of the building itself, constructed only to provide sufficient background for the actors. Eventually it became a part of the building, made out of concrete. Sometimes events are organized in the remains of theaters and amphitheaters, for example in the Theater of Orange in France, called Arusio. Chariot racing. Chariot racing was one of the most popular ancient Greek, Roman, and Byzantine sports. Chariot racing was often dangerous to both driver and horse, as they frequently suffered serious injury and even death, but generated strong spectator enthusiasm in the ancient Olympic Games as well as the other Pan-Hellenic Games. The sport was one of the most important equestrian events. In the Roman form of chariot racing, teams represented different groups of financial bankers, and sometimes competed for the services of particularly skilled drivers. These teams became the focus of intense support among spectators, and occasionally disturbances broke out between followers of different factions. The conflict sometimes became politicized, as the sport began to transcend the races themselves and started to affect society overall. This helps explain why Roman and later Byzantine emperors took control of whole teams and appointed many officials to oversee them. It is unknown exactly when chariot racing began, but it may have been as old as chariots themselves. It is known from artistic evidence on pottery that the sport existed in the Mycenaean world, but the first literary reference to a chariot race is the one described by Homer at the funeral games of Patroclus. In the ancient Olympic Games, as well as the other Panhellenic Games, there were both 4-horse and 2-horse chariot races, which were essentially the same aside from the number of horses. The chariot racing event was first added to the Olympics in 680 before Christ, with the games expanding from a 1-day to a 2-day event. In the ancient Olympic Games, various mechanical devices were used, including the starting gates, which were lowered to start the race. According to Pausanias, these were invented by the architect Cleotius and staggered so that the chariots on the outside began the race earlier than those on the inside. The race did not actually begin properly until the final gate was opened, at which point each chariot would be more or less lined up alongside each other, although the ones that had started on the outside would have been traveling faster than the ones in the middle. Other mechanical devices, known as the eagle and the dolphin, were raised to signify that the race had begun, and were lowered as the race went on to signify the number of laps remaining. These were probably bronze carvings of those animals, set up on posts at the starting line. In most cases, the owner and the driver of the chariot were different persons. In 416 before Christ, the Athenian general Alcibiades had 7 chariots in the race and came in first, second, and fourth. Obviously, he could not have been racing all 7 chariots himself.